Hi, I'm Vice President of Communications here at MIT. It's a pleasure to be with you. Can I invite my panelists to come on up with me? Thank you. We're going to start the conversation with two extraordinary people, and I'll introduce them in just a moment. So, when Mikhail Gorbachev was still president of the Soviet Union, he was meeting with a Western dignitary, and the two men came out to meet the press after their meeting, as is customary. And Gorbachev called first on a member of the Western press corps. Thank you, Mr. Gorbachev. Sir, if you could please describe the state of the Soviet economy using just one word only, what would it be? Gorbachev thought about this and he said, good. Oh, Mr. Gorbachev, sir, thank you, sir. If you could describe the state of the Soviet economy using two words, sir, two words. And Gorbachev thought about this and he said, not good. So the question for us today is, what is the state of science communication? Is it good? Is it not good? Perhaps we can agree it is not good enough. Yeah. How many, by a round of applause, would agree with the assessment it's not good enough? Round of applause. How many would agree it's worse today than it was 5 years ago? Okay. How many would agree with the assessment that social media overall is hurting us, not helping us in science communication? Okay. How many would agree that you have no memory whatsoever of Mikhail Gorbachev? Okay.
That's the young people.
That story has a shelf life, clearly, but I can't help using it because it's a true story. So we got our work cut out for us, and the good news is that today's program is really filled with topics and experts that can help us guide our way through all this on politics and polarization, on storytelling and culture, comedy and hip hop, and the role of AI. But I want to acknowledge as we start out that there is another topic that is on all our minds. It was not imagined when we planned the conference, and it is not on the agenda, but it is present with us. So recognizing that threats to science and scientific inquiry, scientific research, to people's appreciation for the work that scientists do, that all of that is at risk, I think it's even more important that we have an event like this and that we are all here together. It's so much more purposeful knowing that there's that context. And while the institutions that we're part of, and now I speak for MIT, are making the case in Washington, I want us to focus here on how we can make the case with the broader public, how we can get better at conveying the value and the meaning of science to everyone. So in this opening conversation, I am joined by these two remarkable individuals who have devoted their lives to getting good at this. And both have come to appreciate something in common I was struck by when I spoke to them, that personal experience and personal faith and belief are really critically important filters that we encounter when we're trying to talk to people about science. So that's one thing that we're going to delve into. That's one topic. Lina Yassin is a researcher at the International Institute for Environment and Development based in London. She currently supports the Least Developed Countries Group at the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, where she focuses on climate communications and diplomacy. She is Sudanese. She has worked the COP for her country, and she has also worked on climate adaptation projects on the ground, speaking directly with farmers and others on the front lines of climate change. And she has also trained journalists to cover climate issues. So she's accomplished quite a lot. Francis Collins. What can we say about this man? Earlier in his career, he led the Human Genome Project as director of the National Genome Research Institute. Between 2009 and 21, he served under 3 presidents as director of the National Institutes of Health. And of course, so much more in his long and distinguished career. He has written several books, the most recent of which, just this past fall, is titled The Road to Wisdom on Truth, Science, Faith, and Trust. He earned his PhD at Yale, his MD at North Carolina. Please welcome Lina and Francis. So I want to talk for a moment about your favorite teachers. Because the teachers we remember are most likely not the ones that made us feel dense or disrespected. They are very likely the ones that made us feel excitement, a kind of a zap of energy in seeing something in a new way. And so I want to ask you both as we get started, who was your favorite teacher growing up and what made them special to you? And I'll start with you, Lina.
Thanks a lot, Alfred, and thanks for having me here. It's honestly an honor to be surrounded by such amazing individuals in this room. My favorite teacher, and it took me a while to think about this, but the answer came out very clearly, was my teacher in 4th grade. In Sudan, we are taught, as part of the curriculum, Islamic studies. We are taught about Islam and how to interpret the Quran all of our life. And usually that subject is not easy to take as a kid because you are talked at most of the times. You're just meant to observe the information, and if you try and question it with your curiosity as a kid, you're usually dismissed. You're told to just take it as it is because that's how things work. But I had this one teacher in 4th grade, Mr. Ibrahim. He was the one that accommodated the curiosity. I remember being a very curious kid, asking a lot of questions and challenging. And usually challenging when it comes to Islamic beliefs was not welcomed. But it was very accommodating, and one of the things that I remember from his class is that I never felt talked at. I felt heard, and I felt welcome to share ideas, and that's something that stayed with me. Mm-hmm. And I also remember when I asked a lot of questions that he obviously didn't know the answer to, like why did God do this and not that, he did say it's okay to live with uncertainty. And it's okay to have questions all your life. And some of these questions actually end up defining your path, because your journey could be you answering these questions. And that stayed with me. And that actually turned out to be true for many aspects of my journey in life. So thanks to Mr. Ibrahim, and I hope he's doing well.
Thank you, Lina. And you mentioned it's okay to live with uncertainty. And one of the things on my mind that we'll talk about later is how science so often conveys a sense of absolute certainty. This is certain. We've studied it, we know, we've tested, trials, all the rest. It's certain. And that flies in the face of common experience for many people. So I want to dig into that when we get a chance. So thank you for the story. Francis, your favorite teacher?
Well, really glad to be here. Thanks for the invitation on my 10th day as a private citizen. And let me start the tradition of not quite answering the question that was asked. So I have two. I can't help myself.
Okay.
I didn't go to school till the 6th grade. I was taught at home.
Wow.
Mostly by my mother. Not for religious purposes. There was no indication that religion was important at that point. But because she and my dad, who are both trained in graduate school at Yale, thought they would be better teachers than the county schools in the Shenandoah Valley of Virginia, where we lived on a small farm with no indoor plumbing. So what my mother did was to teach me how to love the experience of learning something new. There was no particular lesson plan, at least it wasn't apparent to me. And we'd pick something that was interesting, and she would teach my brother and me whatever we thought we wanted to learn about until it stopped being interesting or it got too complicated. Maybe it was mathematics, maybe it was history, maybe it was literature. And then we'd switch to something else. And over the course of time, you got a pretty good exposure to all the things that you would have, but in a very different way than the sort of regimented, okay, we have 45 minutes to teach you this topic. I carry that with me today. This joy of learning something new, that's something I got from her. But I didn't learn about science because that wasn't her strong point. I did go to public school, and so the other teacher I want to cite is John House, who was a chemistry teacher in 10th grade, who had the ability also to just capture this spark that we all had somewhere there about excitement and imagination and the idea that science is a detective story. That you have various experimental tools and you go and examine a particular problem and you come up with an answer. Sometimes the answer is wrong. You made a mistake. Sometimes it was a blind alley. It is a detective story. But what a joyful thing to be able to take part in that. And that's when I knew I wanted to be a scientist in the 10th grade.
Great. And I love that idea of science as a detective story. That makes it very relatable instead of somewhat distant and clinical. Do you agree?
I totally agree. And I wish that I could say that people today are having that kind of 10th grade chemistry experience that I had. I worry that part of what we're talking about today is the weakness in scientific literacy in much of our population, having never really had the chance to learn what science is all about. It's been too much of memorizing stuff that you could look up anyway.
Yep. So maybe we'll come back to that topic as well. I'm going to open the floor rather soon because I have questions, but I imagine that you all have questions too, and I'd like to keep it a more dynamic exchange. But I'm going to keep going here for a few minutes, and you think about what you might want to ask. I'm also going to call on Kara. Kara, where are you? You're right there. Okay. Kara's going to be looking at questions that come on for those who are watching on Zoom, so we can include everyone. So Lina, you have worked with people living on the front lines of climate change. You told me about farmers in Sudan that you had engaged with. And they're very knowledgeable in farming, but not necessarily steeped in scientific learning. Why were you out there, and what did you learn from those experiences, and how did you bring the spirit of Mr. Ibrahim with you?
So I think my journey with climate science communication started when I was 15, but it wasn't because I was training to be a journalist or a scientist at the time. I was simply a Sudanese teenager who's seen the world around her change in ways that I did not understand. And in that, I want to give a little bit of context of my country, Sudan.
Yep.
Sudan is the third largest country in Africa. It's located in the east side of the continent, and it's currently going through one of the biggest humanitarian crises in its history and the world as we know it. And that crisis is caused by conflict, ongoing conflict that displaced millions of people, including my own family. And it is a crisis that is changing the country. But one thing that won't change, and that thing is also the reason why I'm here and I'm communicating climate change, is our identity. Sudan is blessed to be at the heart of one of the longest rivers in the world, the Nile River. I'm sure all of you may have heard of it. And that river is a huge part of our identity. Growing up, I was taught that this is our source of life. As an agriculture-dependent country, it feeds us quite literally. It is our source of pride, and it's the thread that holds our community together. So it wasn't until 2013 when my hometown, Khartoum, which is also the capital, was one of the states that were hit quite hard by one of the worst floods at the time that Sudan had experienced. And personally, I've seen familiar streets that were submerged, families who've lived in their homes for generations that were destroyed, livelihood washed away. And I remember asking myself the first question in my journey is, how could the source of life and hope be also the source of destruction? And I remember just being confused, like, this doesn't make sense. And at the time, I wasn't able to do much, but I did volunteer for local relief efforts.
How old were you around this time?
I was 15, 16.
Okay.
And I got to really listen to stories of irreversible loss. People just losing things from the same source that gave them life before that. And that's when I started looking into what is the relation, why is this happening? And I got to know, and I wasn't taught that at school, that there is a relation between extreme weather events, their intensity, frequency, and a rising in temperature, global temperature. So I got to learn about climate change, and I was like, okay, I just need to put this message out there. And at the time, I was young, idealistic, and I thought maybe just telling people the science and throwing the data at them is probably enough to shake them and get them moving.
Does that work?
I was very wrong.
Yeah.
But because I also Sudan is a very religious society. Most of the things we believe in are based on our Islamic values and the things we're taught in the Quran. So I found myself having conversations with people who genuinely believe that extreme weather events like floods, like droughts, are a divine test. So farmers believe that this is a divine test and that they need to be patient. And therefore, the idea of human influence causing these type of events was not something they considered. In fact, I was challenged and accused of the fact that what I'm doing and what I'm communicating is also a defiance of God. I was just told I need to stop because I'm doing the opposite of what the Quran said to us. And I was really frustrated because part of me was like, you know what, this makes sense. I grew up Muslim, I understand what they're coming from, but this doesn't make sense because we have facts, we have data, and we can listen. So then that's where I got to my second question. If facts alone don't change minds, what will change minds? And that's when I started looking into how can I place the science and ground it in existing beliefs? How can I speak the language that people speak and make them see themselves in the science rather than talk at them and talk to them from a higher moral place? And that's how my journey started. And then I linked up with a lot of amazing individuals in Sudan who were looking at doing exactly the same thing, raising climate awareness, spreading the message. And that's when we started looking into what is effective communication and how we get there. And we started working on different type of activities. How do we engage Muslim communities? Who are the trusted messengers who can talk to people? And what are the messages that we need to get out there urgently to quite literally save lives? And that's what we're doing.
Well, okay. Now you know why Lina is here. So say a little bit more about those conversations on the front line, though. When you got right down to it, what started to work? How did you change it so that it started to work?
So I'll give you one example. When we talk to, and we focus mostly on floods because that's one of the biggest issues that Sudan deals with. We all know that every September there's going to be flood. To the point that in the past, people to pray for no floods. Now people pray for less damage. Like they've accepted the fact that it's happening. They just want to be impacted less by it. And the civil defense in the country used to issue warnings for specific areas that are flood prone and tell people you need to evacuate. But people would say, no, I'm not going to evacuate. I've lived in this house for generations, and whatever's going to happen to us is planned by God. So I'm going to be patient, and I'm going to stick it out, and if God has plans for me, I'm going to take it. So people are happy to face death because they think if it's God's plan, it's happening anyway. They can't escape it. But one thing that we realize is...
You said to face death.
Face death,
Face death, okay.
So, but because they thought, God will protect them. So if it's happening, it's happening. But then what we did is we started talking to local religious leaders. In every village, every city, every town, there is a trusted messenger. There's someone who people look up to who is mostly a scholar interpreting the Quran and Islam for them and helping them, guiding them. So we started targeting those people, talking to them about the fact that some communities are quite literally putting themselves and their families in danger, and that if we explain to them that this is not a divine test, this is a bigger issue, climate change is a bigger issue, it's outside of our control and we need to act, we can get them. And we started convincing the right messengers. We found those people, convinced them, and then it was amazing how people listened. As soon as the same message that we were trying to communicate, but it coming from a trusted person that they look up to, changed the whole thing. And the civil defense reported that there was a high level of engagement. People were actually started evacuating, listening, and it was the same message, but we just changed it and we framed it in a way that people were able to see themselves in it and were able to understand that actually putting your life in danger is a grave sin, because one of the things that we're taught in Islam is that your life is precious and you should protect it. And when we framed it that way, people started engaging and listening.
Thank you for that.
Brilliant.
Francis, you've been on the front lines as well in a lot of different ways, of course, in major research breakthroughs, but also on the front lines of the great challenge that was COVID. So you've got a lot of learning that you've done. Tell us what are the big takeaways for you in confronting challenges on the front lines?
I think Lina has laid out some of the most important themes. It's really quite striking hearing your description of lessons learned in Sudan and how nicely they also map across to our own experience here in the U.S., trying to figure out how to do public communication for COVID-19, sometimes successfully and sometimes not. First of all, let me say COVID-19 as a scientific effort was probably one of the finest achievements of humankind ever in the history of the world. The development of a safe and effective mRNA vaccine in just 11 months that was put through rigorous trials, including 30,000 people in each of the 2 mRNA trials, randomized, double-blind controlled, showing 90 to 95% effectiveness and very limited concerns about safety. That was just astounding. And that sort of gets lost somewhere. And a lot of my job during 2020 was to try to coordinate those efforts in vaccine development, in developing rapid diagnostic tests you could do at home, which eventually you all probably took advantage of, and in testing out various therapeutic agents that maybe could be repurposed from some other way in which they had been approved, and to see if they had activity against this particular SARS-CoV-2 virus. Most of those repurposing failed, but 5 or 6 of them actually worked, but not as dramatically as one might have thought, except for the monoclonal antibodies that we helped develop. So all that was happening, but meanwhile, this was a crisis. And you know, I'm not sure how many of you can actually force yourself to think back to March or April of 2020, but just for a minute, try to do that. Because it was so awful. It was so frightening. We were all at total uncertain spaces about whether this virus was going to basically wipe us out and our loved ones. Those images of the trucks pulling up to the morgue at the hospital because they didn't have enough room for the dead bodies. The people who were going into the hospital to be isolated, put on a ventilator, and then dying oftentimes with their families far away. Horrible things were happening. Thousands of people were dying every day, and we did not have any confidence at that point in 2020 that we were going to have a vaccine that would work. Most vaccines fail. So it was desperate time. Now, I'm not an epidemiologist, I'm not a virologist, but as the director of the NIH, I was called upon, along with the head of the CDC, along with Tony Fauci, who worked for me, to try to put out information to the public about what they might do to try to protect themselves. And we all tried to do that with the best information we had. But you know, one of the lessons here is we missed the chance to use this as a teachable moment about how science works. Because in March of 2020, we were just starting to learn about this virus and how it got spread and how it caused disease and who was most vulnerable. So we were in a situation of having to make recommendations to the public without really being sure we were right, and then having to change them oftentimes a month or two later because new information came along, like the fact that asymptomatic people could be highly infectious, which we didn't expect based on SARS and MERS, but it was certainly that way for COVID. And so people began to doubt that the information they were getting was reliable because it kept changing and they weren't warned about that. So lesson number one is if you're in a circumstance where you're communicating scientific evidence, start out by saying, this is a work in progress. This is how science works. You get some data, you develop an idea, hypothesis, you do some more experiments, collect some more data, and then things are going to change. We didn't use that moment to do that because we were so determined to get people to just do something when so many people were dying all around us. I wish we had done better. I wish that every time I got shoved in one of those vans that pulled up in front of the house with a camera in it, where you got 30 seconds to tell the public what to do today, that I would have taken 10 of those seconds to say, I'm going to give you the best information I can, but recognize this is a work in progress and it might have to change in a month. Don't be surprised if that happens. Now, here's what we think today. We didn't do that, much of any of us at that point, and I wish we had thought about that more carefully. I also think, and here's right where Lina was going, that we had too much of the information coming from a very small subset of people who mostly were Washington-based or maybe Atlanta-based, and who seemed to be a little bit out of the daily experience of people in the heartland. And they were hearing from folks who they couldn't necessarily identify with, and maybe even in a less charitable way would say, well, those are elitists. They're just telling us this stuff, but they don't know what life is like for us. We should have had a better plan about how to disseminate the information. We weren't prepared for that. Let's be clear. Our public health system was badly broken when we started this because it had been underinvested in for far too long. So the kind of community-based educational effort was often not really possible because those health experts in the community had kind of all gone away. I don't think we did as good a job as we might have of empowering the physicians who were trustworthy voices in many communities to be part of the message. We had far too much of this was sort of top down. And on top of that, I don't think, and it was sort of connected to that, that in those recommendations, we did a very good job of recognizing what the perspective would be of somebody in rural Minnesota compared to somebody living in Manhattan. And most of the recommendations seem to be much more about Manhattan or Boston or Washington, D.C. And the people in the heartland increasingly began to conclude, these guys don't know what it's like out here. They're saying all this stuff, but it's not stuff that we've experienced. And that further added to the decline in trust. Let's be clear, final thing is here, that we landed COVID-19 in the middle of what was already an increasingly polarized society. That didn't start in 2020. That you can go back all the way to Goldwater or maybe to Newt Gingrich or wherever you want to place the point at which we really started not to have such a sense of unity in our public circumstances. And it got worse and worse. And certainly by the time we got to 2020 and COVID, that was a big part of the issue. And if you were going to try to communicate to people who were in this bubble over here, who had a particular political perspective, you kind of needed to have a voice that belonged in that perspective. Because if it was coming from that other bubble, it would be immediately discounted. Mm-hmm. And of course, social media made that so much worse by the ways in which that was a mouthpiece for distributing information that was scaring people, making them angry, and that spreads 10 times faster than simple truths about what we really knew. So altogether, it was a really awful stew of things that took what should have been one of the finest moments for scientific communication to save lives that we've ever seen and turned it into something far less than that.
So I see one or two hands rising in the room. Kara, I don't know if you have anyone online as yet. Not yet? Okay. I have one or two hands in the room. I'm going to go to the room, and then I want to pick up again on this theme that you both raised, about conveying or not conveying our certainty around scientific conclusions and findings. I think that's an interesting question. Yes, sir.
Sure. Hi, this is a question for Dr. Collins. Sort of directly following from what you just said. MIT Press actually has a book coming out next month arguing that the extended school closures were both bad policy and sort of like a political disaster in terms of trust in science. I just started the book. I don't know much about this, so I'm curious to get your thoughts on that.
Thank you.
I think the school closures made sense acutely, but they went on longer than they should have based upon the evidence that they were actually reducing the spread. The motivation, of course, was not just about trying to protect kids from getting COVID. Kids can get COVID. About 1,000 kids died of COVID, so it's not as if it was a complete don't worry about it. But I think the other big part was to try to avoid having big outbreaks in the schools that then would go home and infect the parents and the grandparents. When this first started in March of 2020, this was, if you remember that flatten the curve idea, and that we're trying to basically reduce the rapid increase in infections because the healthcare systems were overwhelmed. The hospitals couldn't handle everybody. So the idea wasn't necessarily that this was going to overall reduce the total number of cases, but at least they wouldn't all hit right at once when the system couldn't handle it. That made total sense, and that was the argument behind business closures and school closures, and I think that can be defended if we were in a similar situation, although now it seems very unpopular to say that those kinds of closures should ever have happened. I think that's an unsophisticated view of what really was the evidence for doing that. The problem is then, once the schools were closed, it was really hard to get them back open again. Lots of parents were worried about that. Lots of teachers were worried about that. Those decisions devolved to the state and the local communities, and they were all over the place in terms of scattershot of what was the right answer to that. And in some instances, those closures went on for well over a year. And I think one can look at that and say that probably was not a helpful thing when it was extended for too long. And it did add to the general dismay and disappointment and distrust of people who didn't agree with that, right. That the government is somehow running my life now and they're treading into my liberties.
Right.
And I think that carried into a whole cohort of folks who then began to doubt other things, including more than 50 million Americans who turned down the opportunity to take part in a vaccination, which in 235,000 instances resulted in deaths. That's a scary statistic that we have to constantly look at and think, if there was a failure of communication, the fact that there are 235,000 people in graveyards now because they didn't get the information about the vaccines that led them to trust that that was going to be good for them. That's a stunning and horrible statistic.
I don't want to dig too deep into the details around COVID because we could spend the whole time on that.
We sure could.
Yeah, but I do want to try and keep it at a higher level on the things that we can learn from this. And before I go back to the audience, Lina, I just want to ask you quickly, what was the experience of COVID in Sudan, if that's where you were at the time? And just if you could reflect on what lessons came out of that period for you and in that time around COVID.
I mean, Francis summarized it quite well. It was quite scary times and uncertainty. I feel like the authorities in Sudan and the Minister of Health were just following the general advice that was coming out. And I remember when they first told us you should wear a mask, and then they said, actually, you shouldn't wear a mask, and then they said you should wear a mask. And I remember even my grandma saying, see, they don't know what they're doing. They're just changing their minds. And then when the biggest moment and the biggest breakthrough personally that I had was when the vaccine was finally rolled out. And I remember my grandma was one of the first targeted audiences, and I needed to convince her. She didn't want to go get it. And I went and I sat down with her, and I was like, Grandma, why would you not want to take the vaccine? It will save your life. It will put all of us at ease knowing that you're safe. She was like, yeah, they don't know what they're doing. They kept changing their minds. This minister, we also had the minister resigned, and we had another minister, so like politically things were not looking well. She was like, I just don't trust the institutions. And at the time, the vaccine that we had was the Oxford vaccine, and the timing worked out perfectly that I was preparing to go to Oxford to do my master's degree, and I was like, Grandma, I'm going to be part of that institutions that you don't trust. So do you trust me? And she said, yeah, I trust you. And I was like, okay, I've signed up to be part of this institution. I'm doing a very different degree. Nothing to do with the vaccine, but I am going to be studying there. Do you trust me? And she's like, yes, I trust you. And I was like, cool, can we go get the vaccine? And she said, I'll do it for you. But then she didn't just do that. She convinced all of her friends to go get the vaccine, saying, well, my granddaughter is going to go to Oxford in a few months. You should trust her. And they all went and got it. So it's all these personal anecdotes.
Yeah, this is retail communication. That makes a big difference. That's really important. There was a question back here. Yes, go ahead.
I want to touch on something Lina said in the opening. I think talking about communicating uncertainty will be really interesting. But the part that you said that really resonated with me was about how your teacher, how you said that he did not just talk at you, but you felt heard and listened to. And I think that that's really important. I think working with trusted communicators is a really great way to communicate. But I think there's a lot of evidence that the best way to build trust is by listening and responding to people's needs. And I worry that we're at a moment where we are sort of missing the listening portion to our detriment. I think trust in institutions are at an all-time low, and that includes the government that funds science and the academic institutions that produce science. And
you have a question in there somewhere.
Yes, I am. I'm going to get to. So I just worry that we're not listening to the public on these concerns, and I want to ask Lina if she could talk more about the importance of listening and how you've seen that impact trust, and Dr. Collins about is anybody listening and thinking about how we restructure our institutions to address public concern.
Thank you very much. We do that, and then we'll go online. Go ahead, Lina.
Yeah. Thanks a lot, and you've raised really important points. I think the point on listening, one of my favorite examples, this is also a really sad example of an organization or a group of consultants that were brought down to a village in Sudan to fix a very easy problem. The problem was women would walk 2 to 3 hours, unsafe conditions, putting themselves in danger to get water. And if we could install solar pumps in the village itself and save the woman the walk, things would be fine. And it was a very easy fix. They installed the water pumps, and then they came back a couple of months later to do evaluation and see how the life of the women got better. They were surprised to find out that all the pumps were deliberately broken. Someone broke them. And upon further investigation, they realized that it was the women themselves in the village who destroyed them. And when they managed to finally gain the trust and ask them to explain why, the woman said, well, because that 3-4 hour work that we used to do every day was our only gossip time. We would walk together, we would go, this is our social life. This is where we get to know each other. This is where she can tell me what the issues she's having with her husband, what the other person did, all of that. And we lost that because then there was no excuse for us to get out. Our husbands will lock us in and just say, continue with your mother duties. You don't need to go out anymore. We've got the bump. I'll go get the water. So even though the original intention was to fix and save and make the life of those women better, they ended up taking something they valued even more than that walk. And I think this is where listening is important, because you can address the problem, but if you don't know what the real problem is, you're not going to be able to fix it on your solution. And the money that was spent on this went to waste because they just didn't listen to the people they were trying to help. So I do fully agree with you, and this is an issue that we deal with right now. When we're communicating climate solutions, is that we come from this top-down moralizing, which never works. You can't assume that you know better than the people. And sadly, I think even though it's comms 101, it's a step that we rush through, and we don't get it right most of the times.
Hear, hear.
Yeah, very true.
Go ahead, Francis.
So, yeah, it's a great question about listening, and you're right that we have not done a great job of that in many instances. I don't think we did, particularly during COVID, and that troubled me greatly. When I stepped down as NIH director in December of 21, I was determined to try to understand how good, honorable people across the country could have come to such a different conclusion about things like vaccines that could have saved their lives. So I joined a group called Braver Angels, which is really all about what you were asking in the question, is how do we learn to listen to each other again? Anybody here is a part of Braver Angels? I'm just curious. I see a couple of hands. They were founded in 2016. As an effort to try to bring together people on very much opposite sides of an issue. And usually one of their gatherings is about a topic. Maybe it's about immigration. Maybe it's about public health. Maybe it's about abortion. Maybe it's about gun control. And it's equal numbers of people on either side of this. There's a moderator that keeps it from getting too personal, because you're not allowed to do that. But you are supposed to come in and express your view on that issue in very clear terms. And the other people on the other side have to listen. They have to listen so well that they can speak back to you afterwards what you said. It's like marriage counseling for the country, which is kind of what we need right now. So that experience about public health was absolutely definitive for me. One of the things in those conversations is you also get to the point after you've really heard somebody and begin to understand what they're saying. You may not agree with it, but at least you understand where they're coming from. Then you have a little bit more insight about your own point of view. And you might even get to the point of saying, you know, I'd like to say, I think I've maybe approached this problem in a less than ideal way. And there's some things that I've done that have maybe made this worse. And let me tell you what those are. And then people start to really open up. And then you have a real conversation. My alter ego in the Braver Angels is a guy named Wilk Wilkinson, who runs a trucking company in Minnesota. And the first time that he and I had a debate like this, I thought, I am never going to be able to get along with this guy, because he was all about my liberties have been trod upon and the government is in my space where it shouldn't be. And he was really strong and very compelling from his own experience in the community he lived in. But now we've gone over this over and over again, and we've gotten to know each other pretty well. We did a session for the annual meeting of Braver Angels in Gettysburg, which was carefully chosen for a reason that you might recognize. And our session was called An Elitist and a Deplorable Walk into a Bar. And you can guess which one I was. And we had this conversation in front of 700 or 800 people about how to disagree without being disagreeable, how to actually listen, how to be able to say back to somebody, you know, the way you described that really helped me, because I think I heard you say. If we could, as a society, relearn how to do those things instead of staring at a screen that has no opportunity for us to have a real interaction, and really reach out and begin to talk to people who we don't necessarily get along with and learn that skill again, we might have a chance, we the people, of doing something about the polarization that is such a serious illness of our country right now.
Thank you, Francis. Kara, who do we have online here? Yes, let's hear it for that.
So we have a question here from Eric Pierce, and he asks, and I may add to it a little bit.
Yep.
How do we use these lessons to help free NIH and other funding agencies from the current restrictions or paralysis? I might add to that, or maybe reframe a little. What can we do within some of the restrictions or within some of the parameters in which we're working right now?
Tricky question. Let's give it a shot, and then we'll move on. Go ahead, Francis.
Well, the restrictions are extremely serious. If you care at all about medical research or science in general, the last 7 or 8 weeks should alarm you deeply and profoundly. There's not been a previous example of anything like this. And I was at NIH for 32 years, so I lived through transitions, and I know they can be bumpy, but this is not just bumpy. There is a real assault underway. So I think every means of trying to resist that needs to be put forward by the courts, and thankfully the people who are smart about how to do that have been rallying to the cause. Those 22 attorney generals deserve our thanks. Because some of the approaches that are being put forward, I don't think we can accommodate really to accepting them without resulting in the dismantling of what has been the envy of the world, the American biomedical research ecosystem, which every other country has been trying to replicate, and now here it is under attack. So there has to be a better way to get the word out. I think right now you're starting to see out in the heartland, in blue states and in red states, members coming to town hall meetings and beginning to hear from people in their communities that this isn't quite what they thought they were going to get, and that some of the actions here in terms of random firings of thousands of people who are at NIH or FDA or CDC, maybe that's not such a good thing. And certainly, given that universities are not just located in blue states, but also in red states, the fact that the threat about indirect costs being drastically dropped to 15% really did get the attention of people in those states where a lot of jobs were at risk, and their elected members were hearing about that. I think if we're going to have much traction here, it's probably going to have to come from the public, and that's what we're talking about today, I guess, because our science communication strategies for the public need to be revved up in the most dramatic, creative ways if we're going to actually get those messages across, because most people don't even know what NIH stands for.
That's right. So let's continue that conversation. There was a question back here. Someone has the mic. Or is it over here? Go ahead. Sorry.
Hi, I'm Brinley. Nice to meet you. You actually have a great lead-in for my question. I run an organization called Science to People, and we're working primarily with influencers and social media communicators to try to make science more accessible at scale. So today we heard a lot about kind of placing blame around social media and its influence on polarizing specific topics, which I think is very important. But I'm curious, kind of knowing that we can't go back in time, how might you approach working with social media creators or influencers going forward? Who's responsible for that strategy across all of science? Do we need to have a centralized strategy? Is it kind of on individual organizations to plan their own ways to communicate using these influencers and trusted messengers? Because they really are reaching a vast majority of the population in very unique areas of our country and the world. So I'm kind of curious how the NIH or otherwise might improve their relationships with these trusted messengers online.
Thank you, Brinley. We're going to ask both of you this question about social media because it's a very interesting one. Go ahead, Francis.
Well, NIH has a problem that our congressional authorization does not allow the use of government funds for promoting what NIH does. We can share information about new research developments, but NIH is not in a good position to be in the lead in what you're talking about, which I agree is an absolutely critical lead. And if I can bounce the question back to you, I'd love to hear your thoughts about how do we line up the influencers that are really going to get traction and have a chance, perhaps, of being in fair competition with the influencers of all kinds of other crazy ideas out there that are spreading like wildfire and making certain people a lot of money. We're losing that battle, it seems to me, and you're on the front line trying to turn it around. I'd like to have your ideas about what to do. Now that I'm a private citizen, maybe I can help.
I know that we're going to have lots of conversation throughout the day on this topic. Thanks for raising it, Brinley. But Lina, I want to hear from you on social media and how you see it.
Yeah, I mean, social media is complicated. It has a lot of good, but it's also been a source of a lot of mis and disinformation. And I guess in the field of climate change, This is something that we deal with a lot. At the start of my career, my biggest challenge was misinformation. But then when I got into advising government officials, that's when I realized we're facing a lot of disinformation. And that mostly comes from the fact that the work that we're doing is going against the interest of very powerful sectors that do not want this to happen at a rapid pace. They do not want the solutions to potentially be taking up so much space. And one of the issues that I think we need to figure out how to tackle is how to communicate that scientific uncertainty is not subjectivity. Like, it's fine for us for scientists, climate scientists, to be debating whether or not we should be phasing out of fossil fuels tomorrow or we should be scaling up technology for capturing carbon capture. These are two potential solutions, and we should explore both of them. But the fact that the scientific community is looking at both, and there are IPCC scientists who would strongly speak to one side or the other, doesn't mean that we don't know what we're doing. To me, the challenge of disinformation and the scary part of it is that it delays action. And action, especially when you're dealing with something that is happening very rapidly and is impacting lives, is that you can't wait. Whether or not the IPCC realizes we should phase out of fossil fuel or scale up technology, Sudan is going to be hit by floods. Vulnerable communities are going to be at risk. People's life and livelihood will be impacted. So, and this is a strategy that we see countries in the UN climate negotiation, we see countries do this all the time. We sit in a room where countries and governments are cherry-picking science and interpreting it in a way that serves their interest. And that's just tactful delays. And it delays action, it delays us saving lives. So if we're able to put the message out there that it's okay for us to not know the solution right away, but it's not okay for us to not act now, then I guess we would be making a difference. We could be potentially saving lives, and that's what we're here for, honestly.
Well said.
Indeed. Is there a mic back here somewhere? Yeah, go right ahead. This gentleman right there. Yeah, sure. And then we'll go over there.
Thanks. Hi. Mark Abrams, editor of the magazine Improbable Research. A question about the big institutions where there are lots of scientists and how information gets out. Until 15 or so years ago, the news offices at most of the big institutions seemed to see their job as having big cauldrons full of wonderful surprises that people would want to know about, and dipping in and handing those out, which was wonderful. And that's changed. Now many of the big institutions at least behave as if their job is to prevent reporters from learning anything unless the reporters are vetted, and most of the great research that's being done just never gets mentioned to the public. How can that be reversed? How can these news enterprises within the universities, again, start dispensing information rather than just defending against people learning it?
Wow, that's an interesting question. I will just say on behalf of MIT, I run MIT News, and we put out 30 stories a week on MIT News that come directly from our labs and our departments. So I think in one instance we're doing a pretty good job, but that, I think, is your question is a much broader one than just MIT. But I don't know if either of you have a point of view on this.
I'm a little surprised by the question also. Certainly what I know best is how NIH's communications office handles announcements about developments in science. There is this desire not to put out a story that overstates the significance of a particular finding. We've had too much of that also, where people say, this is a breakthrough. That word has been overused just a little bit. But at the same time, when you have a significant development that the public would be interested in, framed in an appropriate kind of language, I think certainly NIH has tried really hard to do that. And my sense was most universities were in that same space, like MIT is.
Lina, you've worked with journalists on the ground too. Tell us about your experience in trying to convey science to the public.
So one of the things that I've seen change over the years when it comes to climate science communication, which I think is a good thing, is at the start, climate wasn't considered its own beat. Like, no, we didn't have climate journalists, and departments or newspapers did not want to invest in someone to become the experts on climate change. But then that's changed. We now have whole departments dedicated to communicating climate change. And I think that's important because if the journalists aren't able to digest the 500 pages reports that the IPCC put out, then who else is going to communicate it? We needed them to be able to have the capacity to understand the information and then be able to communicate it alongside the scientists who generated the information itself. But I think one important thing is that we also shouldn't treat climate as just its own thing. It's not an isolated issue. We need to be talking about climate change, and this is something that some news do good or better than others, is that climate is part of everything that we do in life. It's interconnected, it relates to everything, and if we're able to cover that across the different beats that journalists have, and if we're able to socialize this idea that climate is part of your role. You have to understand it. You have to be able to find that angle and communicate it. Then we're reaching a wider audience. Because if it's just one column or one side of the paper, it's not going to get to everyone because not everyone goes to that column.
Yeah. I would just comment on this, too, that it's great to hear that there's more coverage in Sudanese outlets. In the United States, most of journalism has really been eviscerated. My office works with all kinds of outlets, and they really have declined in terms of the number of reporters they have on these subjects, people who are dedicated to science. It's really a problem. So I think that we have to get smart about using alternative approaches, like the one that was mentioned just a moment ago. So it's not a straightforward matter in this country to just say, oh yeah, we just need to educate the science journalists, because they're not there as much anymore in the major outlets. I want to, we're just down to our last 10 minutes, if you can believe that. And you have many more great conversations to come. There's a whole bunch of questions still in the room. This gentleman has the mic. I want to ask one question myself, though, and it's circling back to this issue of people's personal belief and faith as a kind of a filter that they're using when they encounter science information in their lives. Both of you have had some experience with this. I wonder if you would both just talk to that a little bit, because I think there's something very, very rich here that we don't often get to when we're talking about science communication. So I just want to bring a little bit more air and light to that, and maybe it be picked up in the rest of the day.
No, you go ahead.
Sure. Yeah, so I think for me, the biggest breakthrough that I probably had in my life was when I realized faith was not an obstacle in me communicating. If anything, it was an opportunity. And I found myself in that unique position. Remember how I told you earlier, one of my favorite teachers was the Islamic studies. I realized I have 15 years of studying Islam, studying the Quran. So I'm in this unique position where I know what people think. I know what speaks to them, the language they use, what resonates with them. But I also now have access to the science. And if I can find the commonalities and find where science and faith already align, then I don't actually need to get into a lot of debates. I could be using the language that people want to hear. And that's when I started doing my research. And I was mind-blown by when I started looking into the commonalities, because at least in Islam and the Quran, there were over 200 verses that are directly related to environmental sustainability. Like we have things on the mercy of a tree, like why we shouldn't deforest at a large scale, the rights of animals, the need to reserve resources and ensure balance in nature. All of these already exist, and climate science is just amplifying them. And the whole principle that we have around humans being khalifas, which is stewards, and being on Earth to protect it, is the grounding principle that I just needed to do. So that breakthrough made me realize I really should not be taking it as an obstacle. And that's when I started understanding where people's views are coming from, but also I was very able to then communicate my message and let them see themselves in the story, rather than, again, like I said, top-down moralizing, saying, this is what the scientists say, you need to listen, because people were now feeling heard and feeling like they're part of this journey rather than they're just an object that I'm speaking at.
Thank you, Lina. Francis?
Yeah, Lina, I've had a similar experience. My faith is Christianity, yours is Islam. But obviously in the United States, something like 60% of the public would still sign the box saying that, yes, they are of a Christian faith, although 30% of them now check the box marked none, which is a huge change in the course of the last 20 or 30 years. But if we have the opportunity in science communication to take that into account, that 60% of the people we're talking to have that foundation that's really important to them, it's important to me, we ought to try to figure out how to make that as an opportunity and not an obstacle, like you said. And I'm with you. I think I see nothing as a rigorous scientist who will not accept your your conclusion unless you show me the data, and also somebody who believes in a creator God. I think they are answering different questions, your scientific and your spiritual worldview, but they're interesting questions, and you're kind of impoverished if you limit yourself to just one or the other. Put them together, and you have a much richer kind of opportunity to have a human experience. Unfortunately, in the United States, the tension between science and Christian faith has been there and has been particularly intense since 100 years ago. This is the 100th anniversary of the Scopes trial, where clearly this was put up as an irreconcilable conflict, and a lot of people, particularly in the South, bought that and still buy it.
And that was about Darwinism.
That was about Darwinism, yeah, and basically, was it okay to teach evolution in the public schools? Some of the things that have troubled me greatly as a person of faith, what was the group that was most likely to resist COVID vaccination? It was white evangelical Christians. I'm a white evangelical Christian. What is the group that is most likely to deny climate change in the United States and say it's not real? White evangelical Christians. And again, it's because it's those scientists, they're all atheists, they're trying to sell us something that's going to destroy our faith. We have to resist them. So we have a big challenge there to try to tackle that. But to be able to put forward a perspective from somebody who is a believer, but also thinks science is a gift from God, it's an answer to your prayer that sometimes can be provided by a scientific achievement, that feels like something we should do maybe more effectively and more often than we have been.
And you have written about this not only in your most recent book, but in your first book, going back more than 20 years now.
The Language of God, yeah, which will be 20 years next year.
Last quick question, then we'll go to final reflections. Go ahead.
Good morning. So I'm Eli. I'm an independent science communicator, and I'm thinking a lot about this common theme of trust and reliability when you're trying to establish a message with an audience. So my question is, how are we supporting science communication beyond simply marketing? Like, put another way, if we're talking about trust and authenticity, if a lot of the support that allows a communicator to convey a story is perhaps selling a product, selling an innovation, selling an idea. I think about this a lot in an independent space. If I want someone to trust me, I want to be able to actually state the facts and not necessarily, be financially supported strictly by the idea that I'm trying to communicate. And given the state of journalism, as we've touched on, independent journalism being at an all-time low, what mechanisms are we thinking to support independent science communication?
Mm-hmm. Let's see if we can crack that nut in a couple minutes here. Marketing has become a big part of science communication in this country anyway, and that can be a little bit of a problem, a conflict of interest. Do I have a reflection on this,
I think we're coming back to, again, the need to have a diversity of voices that are sharing information about science, including some that clearly are not trying to market you something. They are just trying to share something that's important for survival, or maybe just sharing the awe of what science can offer you as an experience that other people might get something out of. Those pictures from the James Webb that are just showing us the whole universe, that's sharing science communication, but it's probably not, for most people, doing that trying to sell you something other than the experience of having a joyful, spiritual kind of moment of seeing something amazing. But if only the message you're getting, for instance, about medicine is coming from a pharmaceutical company executive, or even somebody who is on the government payroll doing science, there is going to be a little skepticism that rolls into that, and we got to diversify those sources if people are going to really maximize their trust.
Lina, do you have a thought?
He stole my thought. It's really about diversifying the voices, and I guess just making sure there are enough trusted messengers and finding spaces where people from the opposite sides come and talk to each other in a civilized way and agreeing to disagree, but also understanding where they come from, because there's so many insights that you can learn when you speak to people who are on the opposite side of your views.
I think this is a question we have to grapple with throughout the course of the day.
We will.
I want to offer, we're right down to the last 2 minutes, so I'm just going to offer you each a moment to offer any final reflections that you might want to share from your experience as we go forward into the day.
I think one thing that I struggled with, and it's not easy, communicating messages that a lot of people don't want to hear and don't want to engage with, is not easy. And it's always been a personal battle of mine. And I've learned that I needed to prioritize my battles. oftentimes I wanted to communicate certain messages, but I've realized in majority of the cases in Sudan, I was not the perfect messenger. If anything, being a woman, not wearing a scarf, these all were against me, because then it meant that I was less trusted, less relatable, and people already had disagreed. People disagree with a lot of things that I do in my personal life, but I had to prioritize. Do I want to fight that battle and get the credibility and ask them to listen to me, or do I want to communicate the message? And I chose to communicate the message, even if it didn't have to come from me, even if I had to find someone else I trusted that looked more like them and that speak more to their beliefs. And that's fine by me, because at the time that was more important to me, saving life through essential communications. So we do need to prioritize our battles and choose what is most urgent, and that's not easy. It's a tough decision that I had to deal with, and I still think if I go back in time, would I change? Would I have picked a different battle? I don't know, but we need to think about that as well.
Thank you, Lina. Francis, final thoughts.
Sort of taking this up to a high level for the whole experience today. What is it we're trying to achieve here? It seems like we're trying to find answers about how to approach science communication with wisdom. That word has appealed to me a lot in the last couple of years, because it feels like something we don't have enough of. And wisdom is about knowledge, but it's not just knowledge. It's also got to be about common sense. It's got to be about experience. It's got to be some moral content that drives us. That's what we need to be in this space right now. There's a story about how you get wisdom, and I'll stop with this, but it makes me think about this in a positive way, about the young man who wanted to figure out what is the source of wisdom. We all want to know that, right? He asked a lot of people, and they didn't quite know. And finally, one guy said, well, there's this guru up in the mountains who knows the answer. So go and find the guru, and he will tell you. He climbs up in the mountains, he finds the guru, and he says, oh, please, master, tell me, what is the source of wisdom? And the master says, well, that's actually quite easy. That's judgment, good judgment. And the young man's initially a little puzzled and said, well, how do I get good judgment? The master says, oh, by experience. Well, how do I get experience? Bad judgment. Kind of like Gorbachev.
Yeah.
That's where we are right now. We've had some good judgment. We've had some bad judgment. It's added to our experience. Now we got to take that where we are right now today in this really signal moment for our country and our world, and learn how to do something from that is going to help bring the reality of what science and medical research can do for the human condition. We've got a heavy lift ahead of us, but I think this is the right group to talk about how to get there.
Lina Yassin, Francis Collins, thank you so much for getting us started. Thank you. Thank you so much.